I'm also nervous to bring up this next story. I don't want to tempt fate, but there hasn't been a big earthquake on the southern San Andreas Fault for a long time, and we may have found a reason why.
San Andreas Fault officials have evacuated the zone ahead of a potential eruption. With the threat of a major quake looming, authorities aren't taking any chances. Find out what this means and how it could impact everyone in the area. Don't miss the details on this critical situation. San Andreas is the most well-known earthquake fault line in the United States. The dramatic versions of earthquakes in Hollywood movies are a big part of why people who are afraid of disasters know about them. But it was famous for a long time before Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson fought his way through a destroyed Los Angeles after a made-up magnitude 9 earthquake. In 1906, the San Andreas Fault destroyed San Francisco, and in 1857, it did a lot of damage in Southern California. Even though the fault hasn't been hit by a similar disaster in the 21st century, experts are very sure that a big earthquake will happen along the fault line within the next 50 years. It is still very hard to tell when an earthquake will happen, unlike storms, tornadoes, wildfires, or even asteroid impacts. Almost, but not quite. A new paper released in March in the journal Frontiers in Earth Science shows that a part of this well-known fault may be getting ready for an earthquake. Even though this wasn't a huge earthquake that required the action hero skills of The Rock, studying it could help us understand and maybe even predict future earthquakes. The study says, an important question in seismology is whether there are detectable preparatory phases that can be observed before major earthquakes. The next question would be whether all main shocks go through the same phase of preparation. The area being looked at is in Central California, close to the town of Parkfield. This unorganized town has about 20 people living in it, but it is in an area that is prone to earthquakes. In the north of this small town, the fault creeps about 1.4 inches a year. In the south, however, the fault stays put. The U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, says that the fault near Parkfield is a transition zone between the creeping and locked behavior of the fault. Another strange thing about this area's seismic activity is that this fault usually records an earthquake of about magnitude 6 every 22 years. Scientists can better understand these events because of this regularity. Usually, there are 22 years between earthquakes in the area, but the most recent one happened on September 28, 2004, 14 years later than planned. This is likely because other earthquakes in the area lowered the pressure. At that time, scientists were gathering information about the earthquake. They said, some of the detailed findings are specific to the behavior of the San Andreas in the Parkfield region, but many of the results are applicable to understanding earthquake physics and effects for strike-slip earthquakes and transform fault settings worldwide. We figured out that Los Angeles is at a high risk of a big earthquake, but some new research suggests that the shaking from the long-awaited big one might not be as bad as scientists first thought. A new computer model that looks at what would happen if an earthquake of magnitude 7.8 hit the southern part of the San Andreas Fault shows that LA might have ground motion that is 50% weaker than what was thought before. This may be good news for people who live in the City of Angels, but researchers warn that this doesn't mean they can relax. Residents and workers should stay alert because there are still a lot of unknowns about how much damage a big earthquake could do in the area. Ti-Yang Ye, a postdoctoral researcher at San Diego State University and co-author of the study, said, the study adds to computer models that were created during the Great Southern California Shakeout in 2008. That event was meant to find out what would happen if there was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake on the southern San Andreas Fault, which is about 30 miles, 50 kilometers east of downtown Los Angeles. The statewide California Earthquake Center says that the worst possible earthquake would kill 1,800 people, hurt 50,000 others, and cause $200 billion in damage. The shakeout models predicted very strong ground motion in downtown Los Angeles, said Thomas Heaton, emeritus professor of geophysics and mechanical and civil engineering at Caltech, and not part of the new study. That made quite a stir at the time, and then a number of us in the field were wondering whether or not the simulations were appropriate, Heaton said. Ye told Live Science that the earthquake models used in the Shakeout project were not as good as they could be with today's technology. In previous models, for example, the surface between the fault and LA was shown as being smooth. Another difference is that Yi and Kim Olson, a seismologist at San Diego State and co-author of the study, used a new simulation that included real-life geography, detailed information about the fault's geometry, and how seismic waves move through the ground. The results they came up with were better for Los Angeles. The ground motions are still profound, he said, but it's not as horrifying as what was previously predicted. The basins around Los Angeles do help channel some earthquake waves, but the researchers found that the hilly terrain around the fault also scatters them. So, the waves coming into the lakes aren't as strong as was thought before, and the waves going out of them are also not as strong. Still, this doesn't mean that people in Southern California can take it easy. It's important that they actually redid this calculation, and I applaud them for that, he said. That's how good science moves forward. But there is still real data from earthquakes that is missing from the whole study. Heaton also said that the area is now closely watched by a network of seismic monitors, but that more earthquakes are needed to get those important data points. Zachary Ross, a geophysicist at Caltech who wasn't involved in the new study, said that ground motion could be very different within the Los Angeles area, even if the city as a whole was shaking. Ross said that the layers in the middle of the Los Angeles basin are pretty loose and can move around a lot during an earthquake. Areas closer to the mountains, on the other hand, may be made up of rock that is stiffer and more resistant. Besides the San Andreas, there are other fault networks close to Los Angeles, and each one has its own risks. Ross told Live Science, "That's part of what makes this whole problem just so hard. At the end of the day, even if you could get this one simulation fairly reasonably, it's just one of them." In more recent news, 3 earthquakes were detected near California's most active fault, the San Andreas Fault, according to records from the United States Geological Survey. The first quake struck directly along the San Andreas Fault at 8:46 p.m. located to the west of the community of Coalinga in Fresno County. This earthquake registered a magnitude of 2.7 and was recorded at a depth of 8.5 kilometers, or 5.2 miles. Despite the proximity, no reports of people feeling the quake were made to the USGS. At 9:29 p.m., a second earthquake was recorded southeast of Mount Diablo, between the towns of Danville and Brentwood in the East Bay. This tremor, measuring a magnitude of 3.0, was detected at a depth of 17.9 kilometers, or 11.2 miles. Approximately 55 people reported feeling this quake, although it did not strike directly along the San Andreas Fault, being about 60 miles east of it. The third earthquake occurred along California's north coast at 10:13 p.m., near the community of Willits. This quake, with a magnitude of 2.6, was recorded at a depth of 8.9 kilometers, or 5.5 miles. Its epicenter was determined to be more than 35 miles away from the San Andreas Fault. And similar to the first quake, it went unfelt by the local population. Stay tuned as this situation unfolds, and officials continue to monitor the San Andreas Fault closely. We'll keep you updated with the latest information and developments. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any critical updates. Your safety is our priority. Stay informed, stay prepared.